The process we're doing today is really how every beer we make starts, and how almost every beer you've probably ever had starts. So all of the Pawpaw beers we do are part of our like mixed culture projects. And what's kind of more unique about those beers is that following this process, they'll be fermented with a very different culture of microbes. The other kind of unique thing about it is that while we brew with a lot of intention on our mixed culture side, we also embrace the way that those cultures ferment in somewhat unpredictable ways at times. So instead of making a beer saying, we know from brew day this will be our Pawpaw beer, many times the way it works is that we make a beer, it goes into fermentation, maybe into barrels, and then after it's matured for quite some time, we'll determine we think this would be a really good fit for Pawpaws, and that's when we'll introduce the fruit.
The fruit actually has a pretty aggressive microbial bloom on the outside of it, almost like the bloom you would see on grapes. It's a lot more than just yeast. I think there's a pretty wild mix of bacteria and yeast and other microbes. So sometimes we're intentionally picking beers that are maybe a little less exciting because we know that the Pawpaw is going to bring this culture that's going to really kind of develop on its own.
So right now we're back in the woods behind Creek Brewing, foraging for Pawpaws. We try every year to get them, but we don't always get enough to do a beer with. Last year was our best year ever. We got, I think, 375 pounds. This year's looking okay. We should have enough to do something, but not a ton.
One of the craziest things about Pawpaws is that when they're really ripe, the forest will start to smell like them. In fact, a lot of times when we're collecting them, you'll hear my staff say stuff like, they can smell them before we start actually seeing them. There's a reason that most people who are familiar with Pawpaws are more familiar with them as an isolated tree or an isolated patch, and not as like what we were through today, which is really like a forest of Pawpaws. And I think a lot of that has to do with also just human development in general. Like floodplains like this are often attractive for farmland, they're often attractive for development, so they disappear really quick. The woods right around us are really, really cool because they're not riddled with as many invasives. There's not as much knotweed, there's not as much privet. There's just like way less stuff that's just shading everything out. So we end up with this really cool forest where we have this really robust understory of Pawpaws. And then once you get below the Pawpaws, there's this other layer of spice bush. And these are plants that are native to this area and that should be flourishing here, but you don't see them often, and you don't often see them like this. And a lot of that has to do with invasive species that have come in, and then also just a general shifting climate. Pawpaws have like a lot of resiliency on that. Their history is one of surviving massive climate shifts, so I'm optimistic for Pawpaws that they have the ability to do that again.
At this stage of the process, Pawpaws have been picked. The gray bin there, that's what we collected today. Most of this is going to end up getting pulped. For the Pawpaws themselves, and pretty much all fruit we work with, that's going to be added normally after primary fermentation is done. The earlier you work with an ingredient like that, the more likely you are to remove some of the flavors and nuances of it. So for something like Pawpaws, where we really want the majority of that flavor and aroma to make sure it shows up, we try to add it after most of the more like aggressive parts of the process are finished.
Local beer isn't just local because it was brewed near you. It's actually made with ingredients that are grown or sourced from around you. The thing about commercial brewing today that's like so disheartening is that, you know, there are hops growing in the Pacific Northwest, it's grain grown in the Midwest, or maybe even further away, like maybe from Europe. And as a brewer, you just lose that connection to the raw materials that you work with. A lot of the other ingredients and a lot of the approach we have to just beer making in general is trying to do everything we can to reconnect with the raw materials that make up our beer. The woods we're in right now are the woods that surround our property. The creek that allows for this floodplain where all these trees are growing is Fine Creek, so the creek we are named after. When you think about a beer that invokes this environment or this place where this beer is being made, it's tough to imagine something that does that better than working with the Pawpaws that grow like on the creek that we are named for.